So we have the pleasure of having with us Eric Schaanning, who will present joint work with Rama Font on fire sales and price-mediated contagion.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to present joint work with my PhD supervisor, Rama Font. I will talk about our project on fire sales and price-mediated contagion. So I will briefly introduce price-mediated contagion, tell you why we think it's relevant. I will define when and how it happens and try to distill some key issues or key questions that we try to answer with our model on price-mediated contagion. Once we've seen the model, we will take it to a data set of the European Banking Authority and study how in a stress test simulation fire sales can amplify losses and contagion can occur. Finally, we want to look at some mitigating procedures or tools, and we want to propose or suggest to use risk weights as a macroprudential tool to dampen or to curb fire sales. So roughly speaking, I want to think during this talk in three categories. So we have solvency risk, which is generated through a common exposure to a correlated risky asset. For instance, during the crisis, some funds or some banks were exposed to subprime mortgages. But this is a general framework, so I'll make some references to the crisis, but it's not restricted as an event. It's applicable to a larger set of events. So if everybody's exposed to a correlated risky asset, of course everybody's hit when this shock occurs. Then there's balance sheet contagion. As soon as your counterparty defaults, you take a loss. There's also liquidity risk, which happens when your counterparties do not roll over their repos, for instance, or they do not, they withdraw their short-term funding. Now, the third category, which we call destabilizing feedback mechanisms, and in which fire sales falls into, is more perfidious because fire sales can essentially affect everybody, so you do not have to have a direct exposure. You can see your counterparties in the interbank network, but you cannot see who you are exposed to via this fire sale channel. So this is what I said here. We have balance sheet contagion, and fire sales, as I said, they can hit any institution regardless of whether you hold an asset or not. This leads to a concept of indirect exposures, which I will elaborate on in a few slides. Then we have a large literature on fire sales. It started, I'll get to the literature in a moment. Sorry. Exactly. So an important fact here on fire sales, they happen in a stress scenario, and the institutions that do fire sale or the leverage portfolios, they are bound by constraints. So as opposed to regular portfolio rebalancing under normal times, a fire sale happens abruptly when a constraint is hit. This can be a capital constraint, it can be a leverage ratio, it can be investors redeeming their capital, so a liquidity constraint, it can be a margin call. There are a variety of constraints that lead an institution to fire sale, and this has an impact on prices, which is not the case in a normal time where we can trade optimally and minimize the price impact. Okay. And price-mediated contagion is the contagion channel through which fire sales propagate through the financial system. And another key insight that we want to look at is the global effect of fire sales. Because we are affecting prices and assets, and because of mark-to-market accounting, when the price drops of an asset, everybody who's holding this asset will be affected. So this is in stark contrast to the counterparty credit risk, where I can see my counterparty and the exposure to it. Importantly, regulatory constraints, as I said, on leverage ratios, on capital ratios, on liquidity ratios, they can indeed, they are thought to make the system safer, but at the same time they can be the trigger of a fire sale as soon as this constraint is breached or hit. And as to the mitigating effects, institutional ring fencing can make sense for counterparty risk or other types of risks, but this is not going to work for price-mediated contagion, because the asset prices of whichever asset is being fire sold are visible in the market, and there is no way we can shield one institution from the other in this context. Okay, so let me briefly talk about our key questions that we try to answer with this model. First of all, we want to quantify the impact of fire sales on system-wide losses. Then we want to look at different characteristics of portfolios, holdings, the constraints, etc., and how these characteristics impact fire sales. We also want to distinguish endogenous risk from contagion risk. So endogenous risk is when I sell a portfolio or sell an asset, I depress the price, I will take a mark-to-market loss because I'm selling it myself. But at the same time, this leads to contagion because it's not only me who sees the depressed price, but it's everybody who's holding this asset who sees the depressed price. So this leads to contagion across portfolios. If this contagion is important enough, then these new or other counterparties might have to sell again, and this leads to contagion across asset classes. Because the second round deleveraging of people who were exposed to my initial deleveraging, they might deleverage other asset classes that they hold in their portfolio. So we see a sort of zigzagging between portfolios and asset classes, and via this channel, the initial shock, which can be in a very remote segment of the market, can actually spread throughout the entire market or through further parts. An important question is also, what does this imply for an individual institution? How can an individual institution risk manage its exposures? And what can regulators do to mitigate this? So this is a brief summary slide of what I've just said. In our model, we will focus on a leverage constraint. So there are other models with other constraints. We will restrict ourselves to this. So we look at an initial shock to asset values. If the shock is important enough, portfolio constraints will lead to a deleveraging cascade. This deleveraging, because it's forced and because it's not done under optimal trading, will lead to market impact on prices. The market impact on prices will lead to correlated losses in these liquid assets. This, in turn, generates price-mediated contagion for other institutions or other investors holding these assets. If this contagion is large enough, these investors, in turn, will have to deleverage again. This will lead to a new market impact, and this market impact can be considered to be a new shock. So in our model, we will actually do 2 iterations of this round. If you do just one, then essentially you just see a mark-to-market loss generated by fire sales. But if you want to see contagion, you need to do 2 iterations, because the other investors that were not hit by the initial shock but that are hit by my deleveraging will only be hit at the second round. So you actually need 2 iterations at least to see contagion propagate via the fire sales channel. The key insights that I will try to highlight throughout the presentation is firstly the nonlinear nature of fire sales. A lot of models, especially in the recent literature, have highlighted a leverage targeting scheme or strategy of funds or institutions, and this leads to a linear response function as a linear response to the initial shock. However, we will show that if we assume heterogeneous portfolios, we will get an increasing and accelerating response to the initial shock. We will show how this leads to contagion across asset classes. I'll highlight the concept of indirect exposures. So even though you do not hold an asset, via this channel you may be exposed to an initial shock to this asset. And if you do hold the asset, you may actually have an exposure that is greater than just given by the notional of your balance sheet. A key quantity that will appear is the liquidity-weighted overlap that allows us to characterize to what extent or to which proportion this contagion takes place. And finally, we will look at regulatory risk weights and how we can use them. So, to put ourselves in context with the literature, the early literature started by looking at a single portfolio, a single asset, and a single investor with endogenous feedback effects on the price. Then we have procyclical leverage by Adrian, for instance, where we also get a model with leverage targeting and feedback effects. Then Rama did previous work with another PhD student where correlations between assets spiked as a result of fire sales. There have been also talks in previous sections of the workshop where fire sales have been highlighted as an important contagion vector during the last crises. And there are very new papers that show, for instance, Andrea shows how fund redemptions can create these constraints for mutual funds, whereas we focus on banks. Bookstubber also shows constraints for prime dealers and brokers. So there are a lot of different constraints, and we think that the model can be applied in a broader context. So let us start by looking concretely at the model. We focus on banks with a capital CJ, liquid holdings LJ, and illiquid holdings IJ. The liquid holdings will be the main vector of contagion for the fire sale or price-mediated contagion. The liquid portfolio is given by portfolio matrix pi, and pi ji is the number of shares in asset I held by institution J. Then quickly one can evaluate the dollar value or the monetary unit value of L0J, which is just the sum over the number of shares times the price. These institutions are leveraged, so they are partially financed by debt, and their leverage is defined as the total asset value, hence illiquid plus liquid assets, divided by the capital. And the only constraint that we will use is a leverage constraint. So they have to be below a leverage max, which we will often set to 33, the new Basel III leverage maximum. Now, in the first step of the model, the illiquid asset will suffer a shock that's accounted against the capital, and this will lead to a response by the banks. However, the response will only occur if this shock is large enough. So what does this mean? It means that the leverage at the first step must now exceed the constraint, the maximum leverage. If it does not exceed the leverage, there will be no fire sale. So this leads to an asymmetry in losses and gains, and it's also different from leverage targeting because for an epsilon shock or an epsilon loss, there will be no reaction. There will only be a reaction as soon as this threshold is breached. So we can solve the simple fraction for epsilon, and we see that once the shock is larger than this quantity, which we call the critical shock for institution J, then it will start fire sale or deleveraging its portfolio. This is proportional to the holdings in the illiquid asset. It's proportional to the capital. The more capital I hold, the more buffer I have, obviously. And here we illustrate, this is from our simulation study. There are 90 banks in the simulation. I will get to the details later, but just to show, the stress scenario that we look at is the Spanish real estate shock, and we plot these critical shock sizes for the 90 banks. The ones that lie above 1 are essentially infinite, so they have no apparent exposure to a housing or a real estate shock in Spain. And these are the banks that have an exposure, and we can see how much percent they may lose in value on their portfolio before they will start fire selling. So some even lie on a zero threshold, meaning that they are so close to their leverage constraint that effectively a small shock to Spanish mortgages will lead them to the leverage or readjust their portfolio. How does the leveraging work? We assume that as soon as the shock crosses this threshold, they will deleverage a proportion of their liquid portfolio. We make the simplifying assumption that they leverage proportionally across the entire portfolio, so they do not pick single stocks. There is essentially no constraint on saying, okay, we weight liquid and illiquid assets in this part of the portfolio, but following the same methodology as Greenwood and Eisenbach, we just say, okay, we take proportionately across the entire liquid portfolio. And this gives this deleveraging proportion gamma, which lies between 0 and 1. And we see how it depends on the critical threshold over here. Now, the interesting observation is this formula. This is the total volume or the total supply in asset I after a shock epsilon. So this is a sum over all institutions, the institutions holding in asset I, and the deleveraging proportion. Now this response function will only be a linear function of the shock size if all epsilon j stars are 0. When are all epsilon j stars 0? They are 0 when every institution is exactly at its target leverage or at its leverage constraint. And if they hold the same amount of illiquid assets and the same amount of initial capital. You can go quickly back. This is epsilon j 0. So they have to hold the same capital, the same illiquid asset, and they have to be exactly at the leverage, at the target leverage. In this case, there will be a linear response to the shock. If this is not the case, then we get a more interesting phenomenon. Then we get a sum of essentially call option payoff functions, and this will be an increasing function, a convex function of the shock size, and it will be threshold based. So as long as there is no shock bigger than epsilon j star, no fire sale will happen. And we think that this leads probably to an overestimation of the impact of small shocks, but an underestimation of the effect for large shocks, because this accelerating convexity is not accounted for. So this is a result in a simulation. When we shock the Spanish real estate sector in the EBA banking data, then the largest asset class that is sold is actually Portuguese bonds. And we can see as a function of the maximum leverage in the system, if we increase the maximum allowed leverage by a factor of 2, from 20 to 40, we actually get almost a tenfold increase in the response of the deleveraging. And the quantities, I hope you can see the quantities just in million euros. So these quantities obviously also depend on model parameters, but the important thing is the relative ordering of the curves and the convex acceleration. How does the fire sale through price-mediated contagion cause losses? This is given by this formula. So we assume that the price of asset I at the first time step is the product of its previous price times this function. You can use other functions. Obviously, if you want to calibrate your losses to the dollar or to the penny exactly, you would have to work more precisely on this function. But we're interested on the relative ordering and on quantifying what are the important quantities. So this is the choice we make. Delta I is the price elasticity or the market depth. If an asset is infinitely liquid, there will be no contagion. So if we are all overlapping in, say, US Treasuries and somebody's fire selling it, there's a small probability that anyone will be severely affected. But if the overlap is in Greek bonds in the middle of a crisis, the effect will be much stronger. And this price impact will generate a loss for an institution J. And this loss is given by the difference of the price times the actual or the current holdings. So if I've sold a proportion gamma, or deleveraged a proportion gamma, I will hold 1 minus gamma in the next time step. If I was not exposed and did not hold the asset, I may still suffer a loss, but the pi will be 0, but the delta S will still affect me. If we evaluate this function, we see that, again, the leveraging proportion pops up, and the loss for a given institution is, again, a convex, threshold-based function of the initial shock. An important insight as well is that the loss of institution J depends on the critical thresholds of all other institutions. So my own loss is not just a function of my portfolio, but my loss that I suffer is a function of my portfolio and all the other institution portfolios and the other institutions' constraints. And this is the key contributing factor to indirect exposures. I cannot evaluate my own risk or my potential losses by merely looking at my portfolio. I have to know who I am exposed to and what risks my counterparties are exposed to. A key quantity that pops up is the liquidity-weighted overlap, which also drives the correlation spikes in fire cells. But it doesn't only drive the correlation spikes, it also drives the losses, because we find that the losses are proportional to this quantity. So just to recap the model, we have an initial state, then the illiquid asset is shocked. If this shock is bigger than the critical shock size, this will cause a deleveraging for the institutions that were hit. This deleveraging will impact prices of the liquid assets. This will lead to a self-contagion for the fire-selling institutions or the deleveraging institutions, but it will also lead to contagion for other institutions that were not initially exposed to the illiquid asset. If these mark-to-market losses are important enough, it will lead to second-round deleveraging by both the ones that were hit initially and the ones that were only hit through the leveraging and the mark-to-market losses. So before we look at the simulation, let us give a brief example on apparent exposures and effective exposures. We look at a model with two banks. Both banks hold a capital, and they hold liquid assets given by this matrix. So by varying the parameter kappa, we can make the liquid market segmented to completely overlapping. Importantly, we will assume that bank 1 is exposed to the illiquid asset and bank 2 has no exposure at all to the illiquid asset. So we would say, well, whatever happens to the illiquid asset, it doesn't matter for bank 2 because it's not holding it on its balance sheet. Now we can write down that bank 2 will start deleveraging its portfolio as soon as its leverage breaches the leverage constraint. If you recall the previous formula, we saw that the loss of an institution does not only depend on its portfolio, but it's actually this weighted sum across all portfolios. So this is why the loss, the epsilon loss to the liquid asset that only bank 1 is holding will pop up in the loss of institution 2, which is not holding the liquid asset. If we solve this for the initial shocks epsilon, we get this quantity, and we see that it's not infinite. So we have the threshold of institution 1 If the shock is bigger than this, then institution 1 will start fire selling. And then, as a function of the liquidity-weighted overlap and the maximum leverage in the system, this will cause a price impact, which leads to price-mediated contagion. And if this is important enough, then Bank 2 will actually start fire selling as well. So in absence of being exposed to the illiquid asset, or the asset that was shocked, Bank 2 will respond to the price-mediated contagion, which it suffers through Bank 1 deleveraging its portfolio. This gives an interesting trade-off. So we can plot as a function of the shock size and of the system leverage. We can plot a critical shock size curve. Underneath this curve, there will be no contagion on Bank 2. Above, contagion takes place. So we have a phase transition of a region 1 where diversification is beneficial because Bank 2 actually absorbs part of the losses that Bank 1 causes. However, once we cross this threshold, we are in a region where more overlap is not beneficial in terms of diversification, but it's detrimental because it will increase contagion. So we see that for small shock sizes, we have a rather beneficial regime. For large shock sizes, we come into this regime of contagion and where diversification becomes non-beneficial. Right. To illustrate this concept as well on the data, the black dots are the first round deleveraging by the banks, and the red crosses are the second round deleveraging. And what we can see is that there are some banks, especially in this region and here, that were not exposed to the initial shock, so they didn't have to deleverage initially. However, because of the market impact by the other banks, they will actually react and start deleveraging too. And this is stopped at the second iteration, so if you continue the cascade, you will see the phenomenon propagate further through the system. So this gives a few interesting observations, or leads to a few interesting observations. As I said, we have apparent exposure and effective exposures because of these overlapping portfolios, which is not the same. So if I don't hold an asset, I can be exposed to it. If I do hold it, I can be exposed to it to a larger extent than what I actually think by just seeing the notional exposures. Importantly also, just the regulator is able to monitor and to act against this path of contagion. An institution itself does not have information on portfolios of other institutions and cannot compute the vulnerability to this channel. There was also a very interesting talk by Professor Frolmer at the Institute where he talked about local versus global risk measurement, and we think that this falls into the category of global risk measurement because locally looking at institution or portfolios and pasting them together does not lead to the whole picture, which only the regulator can see by looking at every portfolio and the whole network simultaneously. So I will come to the European banking simulation. We take public data by the EBA on 90 European banks and we build model balance sheets according to this structure. So we have tier 1 capital as equity, then we categorize the residential and commercial real estate of Spain into the illiquid asset class, and then the liquid holdings will be given by these items, and the resolution is by country. So this is we think that this is very important that it's by country, because if you aggregate this across all banks, it doesn't make sense that if a bank is deleveraging retail exposures in France, that this will affect retail exposures of Swedish banks. It's unfortunately not more granular than this, but we think it's a good start to illustrate the concept. And then we also add another category of other holdings, which are residential mortgages and commercial real estate of the other countries. So these other holdings will be just accounted on the balance sheet, but they will neither suffer the initial shock, nor will they be used to fire sell. And the equations go through exactly in the same way. It's just that you have a third category for the holdings. So this is the leverage distribution of the system. We have the 90 banks. The blue, the red crosses show the reported leverage of the bank, and the blue circles give the model leverage. So it's just a consistency check that we've actually, by adding up all the categories, captured correctly the leverage of the system. This is pre-Basel III, so that's why you see some banks leveraged up to over 60. And this is the distribution. Interestingly, if we look at risk-weighted assets rather than total assets and divide it by equity, we see that the curve is far from the 33 by Basel III. And this also shows that it's probably no surprise that there was a large objection by the banks to reduce the leverage constraint to 25. So now it's at 33. But given that some were at 60 and a lot of were at 40, this meant that either a lot of capital had to be raised or a lot of assets had to be shed. This is 2011. Yeah. So we want to understand how total assets and leverage relates to risk-weighted assets. I plot on a log scale the reported total assets and the reported risk-weighted assets. If we plot a regression line and transport it back to the initial scale, we see that the reported total assets increase much quicker than the risk-weighted assets. So conclusion is that either the big banks are inherently less risky or they are more sophisticated at handling their risk weights. We also do the same for leverage and total assets, which leads to the conclusion that generally bigger banks are higher leveraged, which could be a proxy for the too big to fail phenomenon. Given that they are bigger and that they might be safe in a crisis, they are actually allowed to operate with less capital and a riskier balance sheet. So now we will run the simulation, and as I said before, our constraint will be a leverage constraint. So we'll set the leverage constraint at 33, which is the Basel threshold. In order to do so, and in order to not have banks already deleveraging or fire selling assets in absence of a shock, we donate capital to the banks that lie above the leverage threshold, and thus move the mass, which is beyond the 33 threshold, to the left. And we leave all other balance sheets unaffected. We leave them as they are. If we do this, we can plot the total system losses as a function. Yes?
By doing so, you put them on a point where any loss triggers tails, right?
Yes. We could have given them even more capital. Then they would have had a small buffer. If we hadn't done it at all, with the leverage constraint that we use, they would start leveraging in absence of a shock, which is not a good property to have. So if we plot as a function of the shock size to the liquid asset and the system leverage, we can observe that for shocks of roughly 10% and a leverage of roughly 33 around Basel, we destroy 3% of total system equity. So this is not just 3% of the Spanish banks that suffered the shock, but 3% of the entire European banking system equity. And we can also see a quickly accelerating response to higher leverage. Another observation is that it flattens off at the top here. This is because in the simulation, let me go back here. In the simulation, some banks go bankrupt, and once they are out of the system, if prices further depreciate, they will not suffer the next round mark-to-market losses. So we do not count mark-to-market losses for banks that are already bankrupt. This is why the curve flattens here. Maybe just to comment on the market depth, we've used the same liquidity parameter, market depth, that has been used in a study by Landier and Greenwood, and also Eisenbach-Duarte. So we assume that all assets have the same market depth and will suffer the same price impact. A more sophisticated way would obviously be to granularize the market depth and say, okay, there will be a larger impact for this class and a smaller impact for this class. But the first order effect would then rather be to granularize these categories, and then for these detailed categories, estimate detailed liquidity parameters. So before I conclude, we want to look at risk weights and how they could perhaps be used as a mitigating or macroprudential tool. Our goal is to prevent a medium-sized or medium to large-sized loss to be amplified into a systemically large shock. We do not look at huge or enormous shocks in the first place. If a meteorite hits the Earth, then there's not much we can do. But what we think we can do is prevent medium to large-sized losses to being amplified. There are a lot of different estimates for the last crisis, for instance, but there has been an amplification by an order of magnitude, at least, of the initial shock. Interestingly as well, the EBA and the Belgian Central Bank, they have decided to increase risk weights on Belgian housing mortgages in April this year. So what we want to try to do is provide a quantitative tool as to how much or in which way should we increase risk weights, and which asset classes should we target for these increases. So if we assume that every bank has to raise a capital Kj, this leads to total added system capital, TAC, and we define the capital ratio as the risk-weighted assets of the bank divided by its capital. The risk-weighted assets is just the sum of is a weighted sum of the number of shares times the price, and rho is the relative risk weight of asset I. Now we will compare three different schemes. We have one scheme which is a uniform capital increase for all banks. This is equivalent to saying we will uniformly increase the risk weights for all assets. The second scheme that we will look at is a cap on leverage. So we just say, okay, no bank is allowed to be at a leverage beyond 33. And the third that we will look at is targeted risk weights. These two schemes have essentially been implemented by the Basel reforms. There is a leverage cap for the banks, which is now at 33. And also the Tier 1 capital ratios has been raised for all banks from Basel II to Basel III. So what we want to look at is a different scheme or a different method where we target specific asset classes, and we want to target those asset classes that are prone to contagion or that are a vector of contagion in a stress scenario. To do so, we fix several calibration scenarios and we compute the contribution of an asset class in this calibration scenario, and then we will compare it in a different scenario for which the asset risk weights have not been calibrated. So I just want to stress that we're not calibrating first the risk weights in the scenario that we are using afterwards to validate them. So we take, we take 3 scenarios, which I'll define in a minute, calibrate the risk weights, and then use a different scenario and look at how well the out-of-sample calibration performs. So how do we do this? We take the given risk weights as they are rho ij, and then we add a surcharge for asset class I. And this eta is just a scaling parameter such that we can plot it as a function of total capital. You will see it in a minute. The rho ij is then calibrated as the loss of asset class I in scenario K, and we scale it again or normalize it by a factor C. So our 3 calibrating scenarios are a Northern European housing market bubble burst, an Eastern European corporate default scenario, and a Southern European sovereign default, or a write-down on European sovereign debt. Then, for these 3 scenarios, we compute the rho i's and apply it in the 4th scenario of a sovereign European housing market collapse. So what do we get? This is in percent. So initially, the total system capital stands at 100, and the stress test generates a loss in the order of 40 billion euros. Now, if we increase capital in the system, meaning that we force banks to raise capital, we obviously decrease the system loss because they have a larger buffer to absorb the shock. But the interesting question is, do these different schemes lead to different decreases? So the capital ratio is the uniform increase for all banks. So all banks will uniformly increase their capital and loss decreases. The leverage cap means that the highest leveraged bank will have to raise all capital initially, and then the second highest will raise, etc. So here we see that the leverage cap initially has no effect because initially the highest leveraged bank did not contribute to the stress, to the losses in the stress scenario. However, as soon as we get to other banks, this quickly drops because these banks have been important vectors of contagion. Thirdly, the targeted risk weights. We see that this outperforms actually the uniform risk weights because we specifically focus on those asset classes that have been shown to be the most contributing via the price-mediated contagion channel. So by penalizing these asset classes, we actually mitigate the contagion that occurs via fire sales and the leveraging. We can see that they're not uniformly ordered, so the leverage cap outperforms the 2 for this small region. This is because, as I pointed out before, the loss does not only depend on the scenario or on an institution, but it's the interaction between the shock scenario, the institutional constraints, and the portfolio holdings. It will probably be impossible to define one capital allocation scheme that will outperform all others in all scenarios for all portfolio configurations. But maybe we can find configurations that do better on average. And it seems that targeting specific asset classes could be such a way. So let me conclude. We've shown that in presence of heterogeneous portfolios, fire sales generate a nonlinear response. It's threshold based because if shocks are initially small, there will be no deleveraging. If shocks are large enough, deleveraging will start. This deleveraging will have a convex or an accelerating effect or response with respect to the initial shock size. This differs from linear models of fire sales, which are a result of leverage targeting, and they also come out in our model if we assume that all banks start at their target or at their leverage constraint, and they hold the same portion of illiquid assets. The channel leads to contagion across asset classes because the shock spreading from an initial asset class through an institution will go to the institution's overlapping portfolios and thereby affect other asset classes and institutions that were initially remote and unexposed to the shock. This is what we call indirect exposures. So even though I do not hold an asset, I can be exposed to a shock to this given asset. And if I am exposed, I can be exposed to a much larger extent because some counterparties of mine hold it. A key quantity to compute this indirect exposure is the liquidity weighted overlap. So it's essential to have a good feel as a regulator how liquid or illiquid these assets are. And we've argued that by targeting specific risk weights of asset classes that function as a vector of contagion, we can actually dampen this, and we can do this without revealing information on portfolio holdings. The regulator sees the network and can increase risk weights on different asset classes, but we do not require institutions to reveal any confidential information on what they actually hold. Thank you.
Maybe two questions. The first is it's on the regulatory response. The first is that you show that mark-to-market pricing is a potential vector of contagion. So what could be a regulatory response to that? For instance, in 2008, there was a carve-out by the European Commission pricing to market. And the second is on the risk weight. So in the model, it seems that it's rather, you would rather think of liquidity buffers rather than capital buffers. And the question is, when you implement this targeted risk weight, is it an ex ante regulation or an ex post regulation? That is, are you able to ex ante identify where or what are the correlated losses given a certain shock, or would you only wait for the shock to materialize to know which asset to target?
No, so the way we would do it is that we look at the portfolio holdings, we see that there is a large crowding in an asset class. We say, oh, what happens if this asset class is shocked? Well, these and these and these institutions will suffer losses. Then we make an educated guess on how these institutions will react. Will they deleverage? And if so, what will they sell? And this is the key insight. If we can make an educated guess on what these institutions will sell and how they will roughly respond to this shock, then we can actually make a statement on how the shock will propagate from one institution to another. So if we have a reasonable heuristic on how institutions react to shocks, as well as a reasonable estimation of what the price impact on different asset classes will be, then we can ex ante say, given this network, a shock of this type will propagate in this way and increase risk weights accordingly. This will, of course, then give a response by institutions, so they will adapt. They will not just sit with their portfolios, but probably optimize or reallocate. But that is, in a way, what we want to do. If we see that there is a large crowding in an asset class, or that one asset class is very prone to contagion, it might be good to incentivize the institutions either to hold more capital against this or to disinvest and invest in another one. this leads then to cat and mouse. So they will reinvest into others, and then you have to redo it. But yeah.
You told us that you assume that in case an institution hits its leverage constraint, it sells off all liquid assets proportionally.
Yes.
Now, this assumption implies that the institution abandons all portfolio considerations in such a situation, and that it also does not consider, for example, market depths of the asset classes where they want to. Now, without such an assumption, how would your story sound?
So I think I would leave the story and include a portfolio optimization criterion. Then you can say, well, an institution will shed assets that are the most liquid first in order to minimize price impact. But you could also tell a different story. You could tell the story, we just have a leverage constraint, but banks also have a risk-weighted asset constraint. So they might be incentivized to shed assets which have the highest risk weight. So they might actually sell assets that are less liquid first, even though this creates, paradoxically, a higher price impact. But to them, it's beneficial because it decreases the capital constraint most significantly. And I have no idea which of the two might be predominating.
But isn't the first order condition that you minimize across, you essentially sell to where the shadow value of selling one unit is equated across everything. So if something has a high capital charge, but and a big liquidity thing. So what they're going to do is kind of make everything equally painful to have adjusted. It'd be shocking if that doesn't come out as the optimal thing.
Yes, I would say. And this is what we just said, it's proportional across.
No, but the most interesting thing is this possibility that they're making conjectures that, I thought the Russian ruble was pretty good, but now we've just seen that it isn't, and they have to dump it, and you get these spirals. I mean, if you were supervising the stress test, I'd be spending a huge amount of energy trying to figure out where these guys think that they're going to do, what they think they're going to do. In fact, if you did a war game, you might discover that their, mitigation strategies are all screwed up. That's one of the things that would be most interesting.
And an interesting point is also we've only used a leverage constraint, but what pops out is that risk-weighted assets can still be used as a mitigating remedy or factor against shocks. So the banks are not constrained by risk-weighted assets. They're only constrained by leverage, but still risk weights have an impact. Sorry.
So in the system, you need to know the positions of all other institutions in order to figure out how risky one institution is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there something like a sufficient statistic that will tell you that in sort of like one number, something like a systemic risk measure? Or what would a systemic risk measure tell you within this world?
I've spent a lot of time thinking how to boil all of this down to one number. I haven't come up with it yet.
Not one number, but that's what the risk weight tries to do.
Yeah.
That's what the risk weight surcharge attempts to do.
But is this the optimal risk weight surcharge? I guess that's the...
Oh, or it's not optimal because there's no optimization at the macro level. But this is what the risk weight surcharge attempts to do in a very simple way.
And it's a function of all of the asset holdings.
Yeah.
Right?
It's the outcome of a stress test.
I have 3 comments. The first, the fire sale story that you're telling is a story about equity. There also is a fire sale story about liquidity.
Absolutely.
Cash, and therefore we must sell whatever generates cash. I would expect the two to have very different characteristics, in that the one about equity requires fair value accounting to take effect, which usually has lags, which is why I suspect that the story you're telling is much more appropriate for the period between August 27 and Lehman Brothers than for the month following Lehman Brothers. Second comment, the mechanism depends very much on who else is in the market. Who are potential buyers? What are their expectations? To what extent are they worried about Lehman's problems? To what extent are they speculating on this process going on? Which I find very difficult to even think of how to calibrate. Third comment, and this relates to the question about which assets are being sold, that should be driven by incentives. And in together with the three co-authors at Stanford in our work on debt overhang and leverage ratchet effect, we have discussed those incentives and found that by simple Modigliani-Miller logic, you want to engineer the deleveraging, asset sales, and debt repurchases in such a way as to impose as much as you can of the cost on senior incumbent creditors, those guys that you cannot get rid of. Which sometimes may mean selling the safest assets so they get saddled with default risk. It might mean selling the assets where the risk weights are most convenient, but the details there depend very much on what the precise structure of regulation and measurement would be.
Yeah, I agree, and it's also what you pointed out with liquidity is partially what Andrea did. If investors suddenly redeem their fund shares, the fund has to generate liquidity, and it cannot generate liquidity next month, but it has to generate it now. So that's definitely a constraint. And yeah, thank you.
One question, one direction, but I think you answered it somehow by saying that it should be incentive-driven, the decision what kind of assets should be sold or made liquid or whatever. The question is, could you also give a suggestion which would be optimal for the bank, or maybe also to reduce the systemic risk? So, for example, could you think about a monitoring institution which actually has data access and which could then, like, for the reduction of systemic risk, could make suggestions on, what to fire sale and what not?
That's I mean,
Yeah, but that's exactly the motivation of the risk-weight surcharge, because if you assume that they're shedding the assets to decrease their risk-weighted assets, well, then they go for the asset class which has the highest risk weight. So if the regulator has a view on this, they want them not to shed this or that asset, they can play with the risk weight. So this is why the risk weights here play a role, even though the constraint in the model is not on the risk-weighted asset, it's on the actual plain leverage. So risk weights do not enter the constraint, but ex post they play a role in controlling the magnitude.
One last question.
You pointed out this convex property of deleveraging. Does it stop anywhere? And if yes, on what does it depend, whether it stops or whether it goes until every bank is bankrupt?
It does stop, yes. As soon as the epsilon has exceeded the epsilon j maximum, obviously this maximum function vanishes, and then it becomes linear. But then you are in a region where the shock is so huge that I would be careful to make any statements about whether this model is still realistic. So asymptotically, yes, this becomes linear again. but it's for really big shock sizes. And that's why if you use the linear model, if you calibrate it to the initial shock size, you will underestimate the acceleration in the long run. If you calibrate it to the asymptotic slope of the deleveraging, you will overshoot the small losses.
Really, one last question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering that. So this fire sale effect, right, is basically due that markets are not perfectly liquid. So there's a price effect of a shock, and that may cascade. But it seems to me that this effect is temporarily, right? On the short term, it will be big, but then in the long term, prices will recover a bit. And that difference between short term and long term, I think that's not in your story, is it, right? So is what would you say as the size of the loss? That's kind of short term loss, and will be recovered in the long term?
So the market losses here, we have a permanent price impact in the model. But for the story, I don't think that it matters too much, because even, say the loss is temporary for a week or two. If in this week or two you have other institutions that are hit by their constraints because of this temporary depreciation, then they will start fire selling too. So you have the propagation, even though the prices will recover to their fundamental value in the long run. The threshold, as soon as you breach the threshold, there will be a reaction, and then if the prices recover, you will have a mark-to-market gain again, but all the institutions that defaulted in the process until it went back, they have still defaulted.
Okay, so let's thank Eric again.
Thank you.